Okay, we are back. Um, so the syllabus indicated that day one we do book one and two, and today book three and four, and book one just ends up taking more time than I usually allot it. So today we're going to do books two and three, and we'll just sort of fit things in as we go along here. So um, again, generally, I recommend reading the text first and then going back through with this lecture. But if you want to sort of keep this lecture up and pause as we go through, I'm always going to do these lectures sort of through the text. We don't do a ton of jumping around. I sort of, in a sense, try to guide you through and to highlight and to help interpret the most important passages and sort of orient our reading. The Republic is, a foundational text in any number of um, disciplines. So, you could read the Republic in philosophy and focus on, what it says about justice or what it says about morality or what it says about the nature of the good. You could read it in, a class on aesthetics and focus on what it has to say about education and poetry. You could either read it in a introduction to religion class and read it for what it has to say about theology. So, going through a text as big and as foundational as this is always going to be a matter of narrowing things down a bit. And so, what these lectures are supposed to do is to help you sort of zero in on what's most relevant for an introduction to political theory, which is what this course bills itself as. All right, so jumping back in, so we left off our discussion of book one. So in book one, and there's a weird sense in which book one is kind of different than the rest of the books. It's different in a couple ways. One, it's the only book where we find the characters of Cephalus and Thrasymachus. Cephalus, as we noted, left. Um, Thrasymachus appears later on, but he never really plays anything like a central role in the way that he does in book one. And in fact, some interpreters have argued that book one might have been sort of a separate dialogue originally. Um, Plato's works come down to us somewhat haphazardly. The work of collating them was done mostly by, sort of late Christian, early medieval monks and theologians who didn't really have the kind of historical methodologies or even the sort of scientific tools in terms of dating manuscripts that we have available to us now. So we don't always know exactly what Plato intended. In fact, we actually don't know the title of this text. The title, The Republic, was appended only later. Again, I think by a monk at some point, but it's had other titles, including The Education of Glaucon, a few others. We'll talk more about Glaucon today. But the point is that book one kind of sticks out both because it has these two unusual characters who don't do much work later on, but then also because the subject, what is justice? And in particular, Plato's, I should say, Socrates' style of refuting these, it looks a little bit like other much shorter dialogues that Plato wrote that usually have that advance kind of one or two commonly held theories of something and then use Plato's dialectic method to break these down and to move on to a better definition. But of course, as we noticed, book one ends without a real view of what justice is. And in fact, book one ends with Thrasymachus kind of moving the question a bit, moving the question from what justice is, and of course, Thrasymachus's answer was that it was the interest of the stronger, to a question of why one ought to be just, or what reasons one might have for being just, particularly if, as Thrasymachus claims, particularly if injustice pays, particularly if the unjust man, the one who always gains a certain advantage, the unjust man seems to be happier, seems to be more blessed than the just man, who always seems to get a smaller share of things. Now, we did see Plato's argument, which is a very interesting argument that the just man, i.e., someone who is able to keep faith with others, who is able to combine their efforts with others, right? This is this idea of honor among thieves. Even if, or even a thief, even if someone doing a dishonorable thing, a bad thing, if they're going to coordinate their activities, if they're going to be successful in thieving, then they're going to at least have to adhere to some sense of justice between the thieves alone, right? So if we agree as thieves, like I'm going to work these sorts of cases and you'll work these sorts of cases, or I'm going to work in this area and you're going to work in this area, then it's important that we maintain these boundaries. So if you watch a movie like The Godfather, for example, or Goodfellas, or any one of these sort of almost documentarian accounts of organized crime, the organized part of organized crime means there are going to be rules, and we are going to evaluate one another's trustworthiness on the basis of how steadfastly we adhere to those rules. So Socrates does argue this strange argument, which seems like it'd be the kind of argument that Thrasymachus would be bothered by, which is that the just man will have a kind of advantage over the unjust man, namely, he will often be stronger. He'll be more powerful than the unjust man because he'll be able to work in concert with others. In book two, we see two new interlocutors, um, a guy named Glaucon and a guy named Adamantus. So these guys are actually real people. These were Plato's older brother. So the the person Plato, Socrates' student, who comes back and writes these dialogues where he tries to, in his early work, sort of recite or to restate Socrates' arguments that he witnessed Socrates makes. But then, of course, by the time you get to the later Plato, and the Republic is in the mid to later stages, he's using Socrates more as an inspiration for his own philosophical investigations. But the guy, Plato, the author, Plato, he did have two older brothers in real life, and they appear here, Glaucon and Adamantus. And the thing to note about them is that they're young men, and they're also, we note that Socrates is with them to begin. So if you go back and look at page one of book one, Socrates is already hanging out with Glaucon. So these are the kind of young people that Socrates would have attracted when he was alive. So these are young, ambitious, but good-hearted men who want to know what justice is. And in particular, they want to be given reasons by someone they respect, someone like Socrates. They want to be given reasons to be just rather than to be unjust. And so they pick up this argument of why one ought to be just, and they sharpen it in some ways. So let's take a look at what they say here. The name Glaucon, by the way, some interpreters have pointed out that his name, even though it was his real name, it nonetheless has something to do with eyes. So the Greek here is actually the same as our word, sort of like glaucoma. So glaucoma is a kind of disease or a clouding of the eyes. Glaucon's name sort of means eyes or means the ability to see. And one thing that we see throughout the Republic is the constant recurrence of the metaphor of sight. So one way of thinking about the Republic is Socrates teaching us to see not with our eyes, not with our senses, but teaching us to see with this other sense that we have, namely reason. We'll talk more about that probably tomorrow. But there's a sense in which Glaucon's his capacity for sight kind of changes over the course of this dialogue, and that's something to keep in mind as we move through here. Okay, so here's where we find things on page one of book two, which is page 35. This is Socrates speaking. Now, when I'd said this, I thought I was freed from argument. But after all, as it seems, it was only a prelude. So here Socrates thought he was clean. He was going to get away. Remember, he's under threat. He's been threatened by Polemarchus to come and to carry on this conversation. He thinks he's satisfied everyone, but no, he's not even close to satisfying everyone. Glaucon is always most courageous in everything, and so now he didn't accept Thrasymachus' giving up and said, Socrates, do you want to seem to have persuaded us or truly to persuade us that it is in every way better to be just than unjust? I would choose to persuade you truly, I said, if it were up to me. Well, then he said, you're not doing what you want. Tell me, is there, in your opinion, a kind of good that we would choose to have not because we desire its consequences, but because we delight in it for its own sake, such as enjoyment and all the pleasures which are harmless and leave no after effects other than the enjoyment in having them? In my opinion, at least, I said there is a good of this kind. And what about this? Is there a kind we like both for its own sake and for what comes out of it, such as thinking and seeing and being healthy? Surely we delight in such things on both accounts. Yes, I said. And do you see a third form of good, which includes gymnastic exercise, medical treatment when sick, as well as the practice of medicine and the rest of the activities from which money is made? We would say they are drudgery but beneficial to us, and we would not choose to have them for ourselves, but for the sake of the wages and whatever else comes of them. Yes, there is also this third, but what of it? In which of them would you include justice? I, for my part, suppose I said that it belongs in the finest kind, which the man who is going to be blessed should like both for itself and for what comes out of it. Okay, so there are three types of goods. There are those goods which are good not in and of themselves, i.e., there are things which are, as they term them here, drudgery, but we like them, and what makes them good is what we like. We like what comes out of them. So, for example, if you go to Fike, what you will find is a lot of people walking on stair climbers. Now, presumably, they are not walking these stair climbers for the enjoyment of it. These are not people who take a kind of um, natural delight in pretending to walk upstairs. Rather, they're walking up these stair climbers, or they're using these stair climbers in order to improve their cardiovascular health or their looks, one or the other. And so they're doing it because they like what comes out of it, right? So that's one kind of good. Studying would be like that. If you don't like studying, accounting, paying your taxes, all that kind of stuff. There's a second kind of good, which is good in and of itself, which is enjoyed in the moment. So any kind of pleasure would be the case. So if you're having a particularly good meal, right, this might actually be paying for you for you in the long run. It might be full of, I don't know, calories and saturated fats or something like that. So it might actually be painful in the long run, but at least while you're eating it, it's good, right? So we have a kind of good that is good for what comes after. We have a kind of good that's good for its experience in the moment. And then we have a third kind of good, Glaucon says, which is both, which we enjoy it while we have it, and we also like what it brings us later. And he mentions in this category of things thinking. He mentions too health. So being healthy, the state of being healthy, the state of good health is something that we enjoy while it happens, right? We feel good, we're feeling great, and at the same time, we also like what it brings us in the long run. So if you're feeling good, you're feeling great, you're feeling at the top of your game, you feel like you're going to do better on an exam, or you're going to do better on this or something like that. So there's this third kind of good, which is good in and of itself and good for the effects that it brings later. So what's going to happen in book two is Glaucon and Adeimantus are going to suggest as strongly as they can that justice is the first kind of thing we just talked about. That being just is a little bit like climbing a stair climber. No one would do it in and of itself. Like if you could have excellent cardiovascular health, and if you could have, a good looking body or whatever, if you could have those things by taking a pill, say, or by sleeping longer or something like that, we would take a pill or we would sleep longer. We would skip the stair climber. We do the stair climber because we want those things. Their view is that justice is like that as well. Why do we act just? We act justly because we're afraid of others acting unjustly towards us. And maybe Adeimantus thinks because we want the reputation of being just, right? So we are just. Why? Because we want others to think that we are just, and because we fear what others would do to us if they found us being unjust. Right? So justice then is something that we do only because of the effects that it brings to us. So I've highlighted some passages here if you want to look a little bit more closely at them. Again, they're trying to sharpen this point as far as they can, but we don't have a ton of time to look over these in particular. What I do want to draw your eye to is the story that he uses to illustrate this point. So the story appears here on page 37. This is around Stephanos 359c. This story, we just call this the Gyges story, or the story of the ring of Gyges. And we're going to read it here. So this is Glaucon talking. That even those who, I'm in the middle of the page, that even those who practice it do so unwillingly from an incapacity to do injustice, we would best perceive if we should in thought do something like this, give each, the just man and the unjust, license to do whatever he wants, while we follow and watch where his desire will lead each. We would catch we would catch the just man red-handed going the same way as the unjust man, out of a desire to get the better. This is what any nature naturally pursues as good, while it is law which by force perverts it to honor equality. The license of which I speak would best be realized if they should come into possession of that sort of power that it is said the ancestor of Gyges, the Lydian, once got. They say he was a shepherd toiling in the service of the man who was then ruling Lydia. There came to pass a great thunderstorm and an earthquake. The earth cracked and a chasm opened at the place where he was pasturing. He saw it, wondered at it, and went down. He saw, along with other quite wonderful things about which they tell tales, a hollow bronze horse. It had windows. Peeping in, he saw there was a corpse inside that looked larger than human size. It had nothing on except a gold ring on its hand. He slipped it off and went out. When there was the usual gathering of the shepherds to make the monthly report to the king about the flocks, he too came, wearing the ring. Now, while he was sitting with the others, he chanced to turn the collet of the ring to himself for the inside of his hand, and when he did this, he became invisible to those sitting by him, and they discussed him as though he were away. He wondered at this, and fingering the ring again, he twisted the collet toward the outside. When he twisted it, he became visible. Thinking this over, he tested whether the ring had this power, and that was exactly his result. When he turned the collet inward, he became invisible. When outward, visible. So this is actually a weird this is a story that bears a lot of semblance to the the Ring of Power in the Lord of the Rings series. And of course, Tolkien himself was a medievalist. He was a classic scholar, so he certainly would have been familiar with this tale. Aware of this, he immediately contrived to be one of the messengers to the king. And when he arrived, he committed adultery with the king's wife, and along with her, set upon the king and killed him. And so he took over the rule. Okay, so what's the point of the story? The point of the story is this. Gyges is just a regular old shepherd, which, shepherds are generally weak. He's a servant for the king. He spends all day with a bunch of sheep. Now, it's probably the case that just evaluating his life generally, he's probably a relatively just guy. He probably gives a relatively honest accounting of his sheep. He does a reasonably good job attending to his sheep. But what Glaucon and Adeimantus are saying here is like, well, what would happen to him if he didn't act in this way? He would suffer all sorts of consequences. In other words, the problem with Gyges, not really the problem for Gyges is that he's a weak man. He's just a shepherd. And so he cannot commit injustice because he would suffer terrible consequences for the acts that he committed. But were you to give this relatively mild, moderate, modest guy, were you to give him a ring of power, a ring that would allow him to do injustice with impunity, then we would see him acting unjustly. And the very first thing he does is he sneaks into the king's house, sleeps with his wife, kills him, and becomes king. So this is what's suggested by the Gyges story, that each of us, if given the opportunity to commit injustice without fear of punishment, and again, the punishment here can be the sort of like the punishment that you would accrue if you committed a crime, right? So you have to worry about the law, you'd have to worry about the person against whom you committed the crime. But then there's this additional punishment that Adeimantus in particular seems keen on, which is the punishment you would that would have to your reputation. So you'd also be known as an unjust guy, and no one would collaborate with you, and no one would work with you or spend any time with you. So there's this kind of double um, threat here. Well, the Gyges story suggests that if you were freed from those punishments, if you didn't have to worry about um, damage to reputation, if you didn't have to worry about suffering the harms that others might provide you in the instance of your injustice, then you would be unjust, that you would always be unjust, that we are all of us waiting for the opportunity to act unjustly in order to gain an advantage. And we're just looking for the circumstances according to which we wouldn't be punished. Right. So that's what the Gyges story suggests, that justice is not the kind of good that Socrates wants to claim it is. It's not good in and of itself. It isn't like health, where you enjoy it while you have it, i.e., it's not the kind of thing where you say, I am enjoying being a just person. It's only good in the way that stair climbing is good. It's good because of the effects that it brings. Namely, you're not likely to be harmed by others and you'll have a good reputation. Okay, so this is what Glaucon and Adeimantus put to him. And, both of these guys, listen, these are Plato's older brothers. He's not trying to make them out to be these kind of Machiavellian manipulators. They want to be persuaded. They want good arguments against this view, against the view that justice is something that we simply engage in um, for the sake of its consequences. Okay. Um, Adeimantus's comments. So Adeimantus kind of adds a few things to these initial comments on pages 40 to 42. I'm not going to spend much time on them, but he does point out a couple things. One is that typically when we praise people for being just, um, and we do this all the time, right? When we praise people for being steadfast and faithful and keeping to their contracts and stuff like this, Adeimantus's point is like we wouldn't have to praise them constantly like this. We wouldn't have to praise them constantly if being just was good in and of itself. Like we wouldn't need to attach so much reputational um, capital to being just if it were like being good. Like we don't praise people for their health because they want to be healthy. We don't praise people for taking pleasure in things because they want to take pleasure in things. But we do praise people for being just. And for Adeimantus, that suggests then that justice isn't something that we'd want to have for its own sake. We have to attach all this additional reputation to it. We have to constantly praise people for being just because it isn't something that we're going to want to do on our own. And likewise, for the gods, he says, it's probably not good that we have to constantly come up with these stories that the gods are going to reward us for justice in the next life. Again, if it were something that like the gods don't have to reward us for taking pleasure because taking pleasure is something that we like doing in and of itself. The gods don't reward us for being healthy because being healthy is something we want for in and of itself. But the gods do have to reward us for being unjust, I'm sorry, for being just, and they do have to punish us for being unjust. Why? Because we're not going to want to be these things on our own. And there's an additional problem Adeimantus notices, which is that typically, when it comes to religion, when it comes to theology, typically there are ways of getting the gods to change their minds on things, right? So if you pour out libations or if you perform sacrifices, if we think about the history of the Christian church, if you undertake indulgences or if you say a certain number of Hail Marys or something like that, you can actually affect someone's status vis-a-vis the eternal justice of God, right? So someone who, and of course, in the Greek version, someone who perhaps acted unjustly in their life, you can perhaps persuade the gods to treat them more charitably in the afterlife um, by performing a certain number of sacrifices or something like that. And Adeimantus's point is like, this is terrible from the perspective of justice, because all this does is it tells you, well, do whatever you want in this life, act as unjustly as you want. And then once at the end of your life, once you get accrued all of these advantages from being unjust, right? Once you've cheated every partner you ever had, and once you've taken more than your share, you'll have all this extra money to basically bribe the gods with in order to escape punishment. And I mean, it's difficult not to think of Cephalus actually when they're talking about these old men sort of buying mercy with the goods that they have accrued. Okay, so this is where they leave the conversation. They're like, you know what? It kind of looks to me as a young man who's ambitious but wants to be good. It kind of looks to me like injustice pays, and injustice might be worth doing under circumstances. And in particular, it might be the case that what I'm really hoping to do is to be as unjust as frequently as I can be, right? So I'm looking to take as much advantage as I can while still preserving my reputation, because ultimately it's only the reputation for justice that seems to matter. So what I want to be is I want to be sneaky and I want to be conniving and I want to take advantage of others, but I want to appear always to others as someone who acts in good faith and someone who can be trusted. It's ultimately the appearance that matters more than my actual actions. Okay. Um, and so um, the gauntlet is sort of laid down for Socrates. And so he does something kind of interesting here. And there's some ways in which, like, the Republic, as you probably know it, really kind of begins here on page 45. So Socrates is sort of bewildered by all these questions. He's undergone this 10-page assault from Glaucon and Adeimantus about all the various ways in which justice doesn't pay and injustice seems to pay, and how it seems to make more difference whether you appear just rather than actually behave justly. And so he's like, okay, let's start at the beginning. Let's take a look at what justice is. And he's like, from the very beginning, he's like, you know what? I don't know if doing this the way that we normally do this, looking at justice in behavior, looking at justice in the man, I don't know if this is going to work. And so he proposes um, this sort of argumentative turn, this kind of philosophical trick. Um, and the philosophical trick looks like this. So as he writes on page 45, it looks to me as though the investigation we are undertaking is no ordinary thing, but one for a man who sees sharply. Notice this reference again to sight. Since we're not clever men, I said, in my opinion, we should make this kind of investigation of it. If someone had, for example, ordered men who don't see very sharply to read little letters from afar, and then someone had the thought that the same letters are somewhere else also, but bigger and in a bigger place, I suppose it would look like a godsend to be able to consider the littler ones after having read these first, the bigger ones, if, of course, they do happen to be the same. But certainly, most certainly, said Adeimantus, but Socrates, what do you notice in the investigation of the just that's like this? I'll tell you, I said, there is, we say, justice of one man, and there is certainly justice of a whole city too. Certainly, he said, is a city bigger than one man? Yes, it is bigger, he said. So then perhaps there would be more justice in the bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely. So uh, this is an interesting turn, and it's something that I find that students don't always kind of keep in mind as we move through here. Plato assumes, and Socrates assumes, and to be honest, the ancients in general sort of assumed this, that justice, the idea of justice, would be the same for both individuals and for other levels of analysis. So in this case, it's the city. Uh, we learn elsewhere in Plato, and everything from Plato comes in threes, but there are essentially three levels. You can call them levels of analysis if you want. Plato wouldn't use that term. But essentially, you've got the individual, you've got the city or the state or the sort of collectivity. The Greek word for this, actually, to be clear, um, the Greek word for this is so the three levels of analysis are the individual, what they call the polis or the city. Of course, this is the root of our word political, and then the level of the cosmos, which I mean, the word cosmos either makes you think of like Carl Sagan or like woo stuff. But all they mean by cosmos is just sort of universe, like the level of the universe. And so Plato and the Greeks more generally thought that if we could find an idea of justice, it would be the same idea at the level of the individual, at the level of the polis, and at the level of the cosmos. Now, to be clear, arguably, we don't have this view anymore. So, um, for us, when I say us, I mean us moderns, we don't expect cities or states to act in the same way that individuals do. So, states, for example, are allowed to violate all sorts of norms of morality that individuals are not allowed to. So states can undertake war, states can undertake sort of acts of subterfuge. So, America, for example, spies on its enemies. In fact, it pretty much spies on everyone, friends and enemies included. And it's not only that it does so, and again, a regular individual, a normal individual, would not be permitted to do so. But it's also that not only is the state allowed to do these things, but that we expect the state to do these things. A state that isn't obtaining intelligence on its friends and its enemies is a state that isn't doing its job, right? Is a bad state. So a state, in other words, that's defective in some level in its guardianship of its people. So arguably, we don't hold this view anymore that the justice of an individual is the same as the justice of the polis, the city, or the justice of the cosmos. But Plato did, and the Greeks did. And so for him, this move doesn't really cost anything. We can say, well, listen, we're having a difficult time finding and identifying justice in the individual, but that's fine. Let's look at a different level of analysis and see if we can learn something about justice at that level. So the thing to keep in mind as we move through this is that we're moving up to the level of the city, but ultimately Plato really is interested in saying something about individuals. So we're going to move up to the level of the city. We're going to talk about justice in the city. It's going to appear hopefully to us more clearly because it's bigger in the city, but ultimately we want to take whatever we learn about justice, we want to take that back and finish our investigation of what justice in the individual, but also why an individual might want to be just. Okay, so um, we've decided to look in the city, and um, for whatever reason, Socrates is like, well, we're going to look for justice in the city. Let's just sort of start at the beginning, by which we're going to essentially start before there's a city, and we're going to imagine the conditions that might lead to the creation of a city, the development of a city, and hopefully, as we watch a city grow from nothing into a polis, into a real political unit, we will see justice emerge somewhere. So at the bottom of this page, again, we're on page 45, he says, well, then, I said, a city, as I believe, comes into being because each of us isn't self-sufficient, but is in need of much. Do you believe there's another beginning to the founding of a city? None at all. Um, so then, when one man takes on another for one need and another for another need, and since many things are needed, many men gather in one settlement as partners and helpers. To this common settlement, we give the name city, don't we? Most certainly. Now, does one man give a share to another if he does give a share, or take a share in the belief that it's better for himself? Certainly. Come now, I said, let's make a city in speech from the beginning. Our need, as it seems, will make it. So this city is sometimes referred to, taking its cue from this line here, as the city in speech. So this isn't any particular city that has ever existed. This is a kind of speculative account of how a city might begin and to grow. And what we find is that the city begins in the first place, like the origin of the city, is in something to do with the needs specifically of the body. So if we look at the very bottom of this page, it wouldn't be strange by Zeus, I said. I myself also had the thought when you spoke that in the first place, each of us is naturally not. Oh, actually, this isn't the passage, everyone. So if we just look at this page, we see that we need food, right, the provision of food, housing, clothing, and such, shoes, et cetera, et cetera. So we need stuff. In particular, he says we find ourselves in need of others in order to acquire all the goods that we need. So it might be the case that maybe if you were by yourself, you could possibly provide everything for yourself, but it's going to be difficult. Right? It's very difficult to supply oneself with all the food, all the clothing, all the shelter that one needs. I realize that particularly in America, it's actually it's kind of a uniquely American trait. There's this kind of attitude that total self-sufficiency is like good, that it's good to be self-sufficient, to be able to provide for oneself. But for the most part, right, this is just not true. So if we think there's a show actually, I don't know what network it's on, but it's just called Alone, and they put a bunch of people who are really, really good at surviving in the wild, and they put them into the wild, and they give them a certain number of items. I think it's like 10 or something like that. And they basically say, you need to survive as long as you can out here alone with these 10 items. And what you learn over the course of however many seasons the show's been on is that it's really difficult to do. And to be crystal clear, these people aren't self-sufficient, even by themselves, right? Um, they are given these 10 items, including all their clothing. They don't have to develop any of these things for themselves. So it's extremely difficult to provide everything for one's body. And so we need others to help us do this. Fair enough. So the city begins, we begin living together because we aren't sufficient and we require others for the needs of the body. Now, what we notice immediately here at the bottom of this page in the passage that I already started and stopped, I myself also had the thought when you spoke that in the first place, each of us is naturally not quite like anyone else, but rather differs in his nature. Different men are apt for the accomplishment of different jobs. Isn't that your opinion? It is. And what about this? Who would do a finer job? One man practicing many arts or one man, one art? One man, one art. he said. And further, it's also plain, I suppose, that if a man lets the crucial moment in any work pass, it's completely ruined. Yes, it's plain. I don't suppose the thing done is willing to await the leisure of the man who does it, but it's necessary for the man who does it to follow close upon the thing done, and not as a spare time occupation. It is necessary. So on this basis, each thing becomes more plentiful, finer, and easier when one man, exempt from other tasks, does one thing according to nature and at the crucial moment. That's entirely certain. Now, what we'll learn in book 4 is that the principle of justice, Plato thinks, has emerged right here. And it's emerged in this first iteration of the city. It's emerged in this principle of specialization, or as he puts it, one man, one job. Now, to be clear, Plato provides two reasons as to why one man, one job is a good principle to operate on in this city. One is because we each have different natures. And so by that, what he means is that each of us might be best suited for some particular task. So we could imagine the swiftest among us might be the best hunters, or the most agile might be the best hunters. We can imagine that those with the most nimble fingers would be the best gatherers or the best providers of food. I'm sorry, of clothing. We might imagine that those who have, I don't know, good spatial awareness or something like that might be best at carpentry. So there, in other words, there might be some task that was required for the preservation of the body to which each of us is kind of best suited. And it would be best then, from the perspective of the city, things would be more plentiful and finer, he says, if we made sure that each person did the task that was best suited to their nature. Secondly, as he points out, we tend to get better at the things that we do a lot. So by specializing, by each person being assigned one task, we ensure that, right, if one person's job is to hunt, we ensure that we have the best hunter, both in terms of nature and in terms of practice of their craft. The best person is out there hunting. And likewise with carpentry and whatever other tasks. If you hire a carpenter, you want someone whose nature is well suited for carpentry, but you also want someone who has done a lot of carpentry, someone for whom this is a full-time job. And so if the point of the city is to provide as comprehensively, as fully, as efficiently as possible for the bodily needs of everyone else, what we want to follow is this general rule of specialization, the best person for each job. Fair. He doesn't call this justice yet, but we'll come back to this later. Um, so they go on in this. They're like, we'll need merchants. We'll need builders of various kinds. We'll need merchants. We'll need money changers. We'll need currency, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, by the end of this account, this isn't really a city like Athens, because if we look at the way that Plato describes this city here on page 49, we see that it's still it's a very bucolic, it's a very simple, you might call it rustic, almost a sort of primitive city. And so he describes it this way. I'm reading at 372a. Perhaps what you say is fine. I said, I really must be considered. It really must be considered, and we mustn't back away. First, let's consider what manner of life men so provided for will lead. Won't they make bread, wine, clothing, and shoes? And when they build houses, they will work in the summer, for the most part naked and without shoes, and in the winter adequately clothed and shod. For food, they will prepare barley meal and wheat flour. They'll cook it and knead it, setting out noble loaves of barley and wheat on some reeds or clean leaves. They will stretch out on rushes, strewn with yew and myrtle, and feast themselves and their children. Afterwards, they will drink wine and, crowned with wreaths, sing of the gods. So they will have sweet intercourse with one another and not produce children beyond their means, keeping an eye out against poverty or war. And Glaucon interrupted, saying, you seem to make these men have their feast without relishes. So the picture that Socrates has painted here is one of relative rusticity and simplicity, right? This is a very easygoing city. They only make enough food to eat. They don't, kind of lust after extra goods. They generally live in peace and concord with one another. And it's something to do with the fact that they don't really have much in terms of what Glaucon calls relishes. And so we find out that when Glaucon talks about relishes, if we skip the next paragraph, he says, if you were providing for a city of sows, Socrates, a city of pigs, on what else would you fatten them than this? Well, how should it be, Glaucon? I said, as is conventional. He said, I suppose men who aren't going to be wretched recline on couches and eat from tables and have relishes and desserts just like men have nowadays. So Glaucon's like, Plato, the problem with this city, or I should say Socrates, the problem with this city as you've laid it out, is that it's not very realistic. People don't just want noble loaves with a little bit of wine or something like that. They don't want to just sort of sit around and have just enough kids um, to replace themselves. People want stuff. And in particular, people want, he says, couches, and he talks about relishes and desserts. They want luxury goods. And to be clear, the only luxury goods that would have been available in ancient Greece would have essentially been some combination of better furniture and better food. And so he's saying this isn't realistic because these people don't actually want luxury goods. These people don't have the sorts of desires that we actually witness in watching other people's behavior. And so Socrates says, all right, I said, I understand. We are, as it seems, considering not only how a city, but also a luxurious city comes into being. Perhaps that's not bad either, for in considering such a city too, I'm at the bottom of the page here. We would probably see in what way justice and injustice naturally grow in cities. Now, the true city, in my opinion, is the one we just described, a healthy city, as it were. But if you want to, let's look at a feverish city too, a city um, with fever. So this is actually a bigger moment than it might initially appear. So something that's going on in Plato, as I mentioned earlier, Plato does everything in threes. The process of building the city in speech, it takes place across three of what we will call iterations, three iterations of the city in speech. The first iteration of the city, so an iteration just means sort of an instance, one version of the city in speech. The first version of the city in speech we've already seen, and it's the one that comes into being on the basis of this kind of rudimentary division of labor. And it ends almost as quickly as it begins. So the first iteration of the city is the city that is focused on the goods of the body. It's a city that's relatively simple. It's a city that operates according to the view of one man, one job. Right? That's the first iteration of the city. And what Glaucon does when he suggests that this city is insufficient because it doesn't include luxury goods is he moves us on to the second iteration of the city. And what we find is that the second iteration of the city begins with the need for luxury. And what we witness is that the second iteration of the city, in emphasizing the need for luxury, what it does is it introduces conflict. Um, Luxury goods, wanting more than one needs, leads one into conflict with one another, but also, and maybe more importantly, into conflict with those around us. So we see the bottom of the next page. This is page 40, sorry, page 50. Um, blah, 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 blah. We must cut off a piece of our neighbor's land if we're going to have sufficient for pasture and tillage, and they in turn from ours, if they themselves go to the unlimited acquisition of money, overstepping the boundary of the necessary. All right, so we want luxury goods, and when you start wanting luxury goods, there's never enough luxury goods. Like no one's ever satisfied with the amount of stuff um, that they have. I mean, look at guys like Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett has a cajillion dollars. Elon Musk has a cajillion dollars, and they're still working, right? Think about the people in your life who have plenty of money. They probably have plenty of money, they have plenty of stuff, and yet they want more, right? So luxury goods generally don't have a stopping point. You're constantly needing to acquire and acquire and acquire, and eventually you're going to need stuff that your friends have and stuff that your neighbors have. So we're going to eventually need to cut off a piece of our neighbor's land. Quite necessarily, Socrates, he said, after that, won't we go to war as a consequence, Glaucon? Or how will it be? Like that, he said. And let's not yet say whether war works evil or good. So he's like, just set to the side whether or not this is a good thing, but only this much, that we have in its turn found the origin of war in those things whose presence in cities most of all produces evils, both private and public, most certainly. Now, my friend, the city must be still bigger, and not by a small number, but by a whole army, which will go out and do battle with invaders for all the wealth and all the things we were just now talking about. So this first iteration of the city, the one that's focused on the body, the one that's relatively simple, the one that operates according to the principle of one man, one job, it's also going to be populated mostly by what we can just call commoners. And what I mean by commoners isn't like, this isn't derogatory in any sense. I just mean that these are economic actors, right? These are people who have everyday jobs, the everyday jobs of productive labor, right? Whereas the luxurious city leads to war, which leads to a new class of people. Now, the important thing about this is that for Plato, there's a qualitative distinction between the kind of work being done in the first city and the kind of work that luxury will require. Luxury requires war, war requires warriors, and warriors are a different kind of thing than commoners. And he calls these warriors, he calls them guardians. Now, the thing about guardians and the thing about making war is that it doesn't follow the same kind of logic that common economic productivity does. And the reason why is because, I mean, you have to die, right? You always have to risk your life in the process of making war. Now, in the process of economic production, you don't often have to risk your life. If you had to risk your life in the course of economic production, you probably wouldn't do it. Why? Because the only point of doing economic production is to enjoy the thing that you make, right? So if someone was like, "Hey, do you want these muffins?" Right? This is just a standard economic exchange. In exchange for the muffins, I want your life. Well, you would never make that deal, and the reason is because you need your life in order to enjoy the muffins. So you wouldn't exchange your life for it. You also wouldn't exchange any kind of like threat on your life. So I'll give you these muffins, but I want you to play Russian roulette with me or something like that. Again, you wouldn't do that. Why? Because the risk of death means you're not going to enjoy the muffins, means there's no point in engaging in this kind of economic exchange. So guardianship, which is to say undertaking war, is a fundamentally different kind of job. And so what moves us into the second iteration of the city, it's not so much the introduction of luxury as it's the introduction of a second kind of person, a second nature. Um, so warriors or guardians are going to have a different nature than the commoners. They're going to be a different kind of person. So we see at the bottom of page 51, then I said, to the extent that the work of the guardians is more important, it would require more leisure time than the other tasks, as well as greater art and diligence. I certainly think so, we said. And also a nature fit for the pursuit, of course. Then it's our job, as it seems, to choose, if we're able, which are the natures and what kind they are fit for guarding the city. Okay, fair enough. Now, we have this odd discussion here. We start talking about dogs, and there's a couple of things that we want to pick out of this conversation about dogs. So the first thing to note, and this is page 52, Stephanos pagination 375b. Um, he says, listen, they need to have sharp senses, they need to have fit bodies, and they need to be strong minds. They need to have courage. Courage is important. And then he writes here, then will horse or dog or any other animal whatsoever be willing to be courageous if it's not spirited? Haven't you noticed how irresistible and unbeatable spirit is, so that its presence makes every soul fearless and invincible in the face of everything? So the second thing is this idea of spirit. Now, the Greek term that we're going to use a lot here to describe this spirit, the Greek term is thumos. This is sometimes spelled thymos, but we're going to call it thumos because the Y is pronounced like a U. And someone who has thumos, who has spirit, we could say that they have a certain thumotic quality. They have a thumotic quality of soul. Commoners do not have thumos. Um, if we had to attach a Greek word to it, we could call it epithumia, which just corresponds with the idea of appetites. Right. So the first iteration of the city and the kind of people who populate the first iteration of the city are people who are guided by their appetites. Right. They're engaged in economic production, and they engage in economic production because they need to satisfy the appetites of the body. They're interested in food and shelter and clothing and just generally being happy, being satisfied. Whereas someone who is spirited needs more than just the things of the body. They need this extra thing, this thing called spirit. They need their spirits to be satisfied. They need to engage in certain thumotic pursuits. They need, in other words, to show others that they are good in some way. They have this sort of need to compete and to contest with others. So we introduce the second type of citizen, the second nature, namely the guardian, the one who will engage in war, and we at the same time see the second quality of soul, namely the thumotic quality of soul.
Okay, so note that, and then note a little bit further down here. Glaucon, I said, with such natures, how will they not be savage to one another and the rest of citizens? By Zeus, he said it won't be easy. Yet they must be gentle to their own and cruel to enemies. If not, they'll not wait for others to destroy them, but they'll do it for themselves beforehand. Now, this is a very curious way of phrasing what they will be like. They will be gentle to their own, and they will be cruel to enemies. So if we're thinking back to what we've already seen, we know that Polemarchus, whose name, as we note, means arch combatant, right? General, statesman. His definition of justice, what it means to be just, was to do good to friends and to harm to enemies. So, this second type of citizen, this thumatic souled person, the guardian, the warrior, we can see already there's a kind of resemblance between this sort of person and Polemarchus, right? Polemarchus has these qualities. And on top of that, we've already seen that his definition of justice looks a little bit like what we expect them to be, namely gentle to their own and cruel to enemies. So just note that congruence in the first place. Now we have these interesting passages on the next page about the philosopher dog. So I'm here on page 53, 375E. Then I said, it's possible after all, and what we're seeking for in the guardian isn't against nature. Doesn't seem so. In your opinion, then, does the man who will be a fit guardian need, in addition to spiritedness, also to be a philosopher in his nature? How's that? He said, I don't understand. This too you'll observe in dogs, and it's a thing in the beast worthy of your wonder. What? When it sees someone it doesn't know, it's angry, although it never had any bad experience with him. And when it sees someone it knows, it greets him warmly, even if it never had a good experience with him. Didn't you ever wonder about this before? Um, no, I haven't paid very much attention to it up to now, but it's plain that it really does this. Well, this does look like an attractive affection of its nature and truly philosophic. In what way? In that it distinguishes friendly from hostile looks by nothing other than by having learned the one and being ignorant of the other. So there, we know that they're going to be a kind of philosopher dogs. Now, what this idea of philosophy, what it really introduces um, for this discussion, it introduces this idea of knowledge. So we need a spirited person. We need someone who is going to be willing to, if need be, risk their lives to protect everyone, to engage in war on behalf of everyone. But at the same time, we need this to be properly directed. We need it to be educated in some way. In the same way that a dog has to be taught who is a friend and who is an enemy, we have to teach um, these guardians who is a friend and who is an enemy. And so what happens now, and it begins here on the next page, page 54, right in the middle of the page at 376E, come then like men telling tales in a tale and at their leisure. Let's educate the men in speech. What it does is it sets off the rest of this book, book two, and most of book three, which we are going to skip almost all of this material. What it sets up is Plato's emphasis on the education of the guardian. So we're going to skip all of this. It's an extended discussion, a lot of it about poetry. But what I want to note is just a few things. On the one hand, what I want you to note is that um, Plato really is very skeptical towards the Greek poetry as it stands. He's skeptical towards what we today know as like Greek mythology, so the sorts of tales of the gods that we know of today. That we, that if you picked up a book on Greek mythology, if you picked up one of these Rick Warden books on Percy Jackson, whatever, these stories of Greek gods. But he's also very skeptical of Homer and the great Homeric epics. And of course, this is a very topical thing, given that we're about to be we have these new accounts of the Homeric Odyssey coming into movie theaters this summer, so this should be fun. All well and good. So here's what Plato doesn't like about these. What he doesn't like about these stories is the way it depicts the gods. And in particular, he doesn't like what it teaches us about the gods. So in the rest of book two, for example, what we see is that the gods often act unjustly. They often lie. They often do evil things, right? So if we read one of the Homeric epics, for example, what we find is the gods intervening on behalf of different characters. We find the gods intervening on behalf of different cities. We find the gods often pitted against one another. We find the gods often doing sort of bad things. So, for example, even if we just open the Odyssey, if you know anything about Homer's Odyssey, we know that Odysseus is stuck on this island with Calliope, and he's stuck there because Poseidon won't let him leave. And so the entire action of the Odyssey is set off when Poseidon sort of he kind of loses track of, or he just stops caring about Odysseus, and the other gods launch a plan to get him out. So, like, Poseidon is just he's being vengeful in this instance. So Odysseus has killed his son, and so Poseidon's like, I'm going to take it out on this guy, and that's just not a cool thing to do. And so what we find is the Greek gods constantly lying. The figure of Zeus, right, the king of the gods, he cheats on his wife all the time, and he cheats on his wife in ways that are kind of, I mean, they're sort of funny and amusing to us now. So he does a lot of lying. We know that Zeus often turns himself into different forms. So he changes into a man in order to sleep with various human women. He changes himself into the shape of animals. And Plato hates this stuff. He's like, God shouldn't behave this way. God shouldn't be deceitful. God shouldn't be deceptive. He shouldn't be evil, like he shouldn't cause others harm. He shouldn't change into a shape that's less than what God demands. He shouldn't do any of this kind of stuff. And so um, he kind of goes about reforming Greek poetry, but he's always does so with the specific thing in mind. He wants to provide good stories in which God acts justly and God acts in a way that brings only about good, because he wants the guardian class to imitate God in these things, right? You've got this guardian class who's going to be charged with being violent on behalf of everyone, and you want them led by certain ideas of the good and the just. You don't want them thinking that to be unjust is perfectly permissible. You don't want them thinking that if they had a ring of Gyges, they could do whatever they wanted. And so for the rest of this book, and for much of book three, um, he's just talking about reforming poetry, and he's talking about doing it in a way that will make sure that the guardians have a proper education. I'm going to skip over a lot of this. Again, it doesn't really bear on what we want out of this directly, and we're going to skip clear up to page 91 in the text, the very end of book three. And the reason we're going to skip here is because something interesting happens here, and that is that Plato takes up the question, or I should say Socrates and his interlocutors take up the question of who will rule? Who will rule in this city? So we've got this guardian class. They're going to be sort of above the commoners. And the question becomes like, okay, so we know they have to get this special education. We know that we're going to have to reform poetry. We know that we're going to have to put them through this rigorous training. We know they're going to have to be organized. So, in the same way that an army requires a general, who is going to rule over these guardians? Who is going to exercise the qualities of rulership? So, we see here on page 91 in the middle of the page, 412c. All right, I said, after that, what would it be that we must determine? Isn't it who among these men will rule and who be ruled? Of course, that the rulers must be older and ruled younger is plain, isn't it? Yes, it is. And that they must be the best among them, that's plain too. And the best of the farmers, aren't they the most skillful at farming? Yes. And since they must be the best of the guardians, mustn't they be the most skillful at guarding the city? Yes. Mustn't they, to begin with, be prudent in such matters as well as powerful? And moreover, mustn't they care for the city? That's so. A man would care most for that which he happened to love, necessarily. And wouldn't he surely love something most when he believed that the same things are advantageous to it and himself? And when he supposed that if it did well, he too himself would do well along with it, and if it didn't, neither would he. That's so. Then we must select from the other guardians the sort of men who, upon our consideration, from everything in their lives, look as if they were entirely eager to do what they believe to be advantageous to the city and would in no way be willing to do what is not. So fair enough. And notice too that the selection of the rulers here looks a little bit like the way we might select for military leadership. So there's basically two conditions that he supplies for selection of rulers. One is age. And so if we look around the military, we do note that generals, right, that advancement typically comes along with something called time served, right? So generals tend to have a kind of seniority, and typically organizations, leadership positions in organizations more generally are handed out according to seniority. So he does mention that, but almost immediately he goes from age to something like dedication to the city. So he's like, we're going to have to watch them very, very closely. And we're going to have to see in good times and in bad, do they always love the city? Do they ever really wonder whether or not they could actually take advantage of the city? And so the ones who are oldest and who love the city the best, those who have the true guardian spirit, they're going to be the ones that we select to rule. And then on page 93, he says the following: Isn't it then truly most correct to call these men complete guardians? They can guard over enemies from without and friends from within, so that the ones will not wish to do harm and the others will be unable to. The young, whom we were calling guardians up to now, we shall call auxiliaries and helpers of the ruler's convictions. All right, so this is actually pretty important. So again, everything comes in threes. We now have three classes in the city, right? So we have at the top, we have the true guardians. These will be those who rule over the city, and they rule over the warriors and the commoners alike. And we've selected them on the basis of seniority and on the basis of their love of the city. So they're the top class, they are the guardian class. Below that, based on this paragraph here, we have a class of what he calls auxiliaries. Now, the word auxiliary just means helper. So the auxiliaries are going to be the rest of the warriors, right? The rest of that guardian class. What we've done is, right, we had the commoners, then we introduced war, which meant we introduced a warrior class. So now we have two classes. Now what we've done is we've split that warrior class. We've split it into the main body of warriors. They're going to get this new name called auxiliary, right? So the army, that's the auxiliaries. They're the helpers. And what they're helping is the guardians, the true rulers of the class of the city, right? So we've got three classes now: the guardians, those who help the guardians, and the commoners. We've got three classes: guardians, auxiliaries, commoners. And this is actually important. This is going to be extremely important for what the just city ends up looking like in books 4 and 5. Finally, one last thing in book 3, and that is this. The example of um, what is often referred to as the myth of the metals. So what the myth of the metals is, it's an example of what Socrates calls a noble lie. So this is a lie in the sense that it's not true. It's a kind of story or myth, but it's told for noble reasons. So let's read what he says about the myth of the metals. Sorry, we're at the bottom here of 93. So he's like, you know what what we really need is one last thing to kind of finish this off. He's like, go ahead, tell us what's the last thing. And he's very hesitant because this is a lie, and Socrates doesn't like to lie. I shall speak, and yet I don't know what I'll use for daring, but the last line here, or speeches and telling it. And I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth, at that time, they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they are in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it. If anyone attacks, and they must think of the other citizens as brothers and born of the earth. It wasn't, he said, for telling that you were so long ashamed to tell the lie. It was indeed appropriate, I said. All the same, hear out the rest of the tale. All of you in the city are certainly brothers, we shall say to them in telling the tale. But the God, in fashioning those of you who are most competent to rule, mixed gold in at their birth. This is why they are most honored. And auxiliaries, silver, and iron and bronze in the farmers and the other craftsmen. So because you're all related, although for the most part you'll produce offspring like yourselves, it sometimes happens that a silver child will be born from a golden parent, a golden child from a silver parent, and similarly all the others from each other. Hence the God commands the rulers first and foremost to be of nothing such good guardians, and to keep over nothing so careful as watch the children, seeing which of these metals is mixed in their souls. So this is kind of odd. And essentially what it does is he's saying, listen, each of you, this is a myth, so we're going to tell them the story. We're going to tell them this lie. We're going to tell them that each of them has in their souls, they were birthed with, they did not choose, but they were meant for some role in the city. So if they have gold in their souls, they were meant to be rulers. If they have silver in their souls, they were meant to be auxiliaries. And if they have iron or bronze in their soul, they were meant to be commoners. And by telling this lie, what you do, and the reason what makes it a noble lie rather than just a lie, is you give people a reason to stay in their lane, to stay in the job that's been assigned to them, right? If they're a carpenter, we don't want them defending the city, and we don't want them thinking that they're fit to rule the city. And so, if you're a carpenter, listen, you've got iron in your soul. Stick with carpentry. That is what the earth meant for you to do. And likewise, if you're a ruler, we don't want you doing carpentry. We don't want you wasting your time in the rank and file of the military. We want you focused on ruling. That's the thing that you were meant to do. So we have the return of that principle of specialization that we saw in the first iteration of the city. But this time, we need this myth to make it a lived reality for everyone. We need to tell everyone this was meant for them, that God intended them for this or that role, and that therefore they have an obligation to God to preserve this role. All right, so that's enough for today. We'll leave there at the myth of the metals and the noble eye, and we'll pick up tomorrow with book 4. As usual, email me with any questions, any concerns, any problems, any comments, any insights, whatever. Good luck, and we'll talk. We'll talk soon.